Hello friends, Matt here with Donak Arquiescat. This is the last video in a series of videos critiquing Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And in this video, we're going to consider chapters 6 through 10. And before we launch into it, I'm going to invite you to check out my books. The links are in the information below. You can buy them on Amazon from En route Books and Media. So in chapters 6 through 10, there is very little, if anything, like an argument against the existence of God. He thinks he's already taken care of that earlier in the book. And so now he's looking at why do we believe in God in the first place, or why are there morals? Where does our moral standard come from? If there is no God, can we be good without God? That kind of thing. And still, all of it is couched in language that's meant simply to ridicule. It's rhetoric, it's disparaging, insulting. It can be very effective if you're not aware of the philosophy and all the mistakes that he's making. Dawkins goes in search of a Darwinian explanation for why there are morals, for why there is this moral sense. But again, it's important to keep in mind that even if you come up with a Darwinian explanation for why there's a moral sense, that doesn't in some way disprove that God exists. It doesn't disprove the moral sense. All it is just a description of how the moral sense developed in us. He also says that he thinks more highly of human beings than to say that if we took God out of the picture, that there would then be no motivation for being good. So he's saying that some people argue that if you took God out of the picture, then there's no motivation for being good. But that's not the argument that good philosophers make. The argument that philosophers are making is that if there is no God, then those morals, wherever they come from, are not binding on us. Now, to Dawkins' credit, he essentially admits this in one place. He then tries to use it against believers in other places, but he basically says that if there is no true religion, then there is no absolute standard of morality. He says the springboard for this discussion of moral philosophy was a hypothetical religious claim that without a God, morals are relative and arbitrary. Kant and other sophisticated moral philosophers apart, and with due recognition given to patriotic fervor, the preferred source of absolute morality is usually a holy book of some kind, interpreted as having an authority far beyond its history's capacity to justify. So he's setting up the idea that religious people claim an absolute authority. And then what does he do? Does he refute it? Does he come up with some other atheistic grounds for an absolute standard of morality? No, at this point he changes the subject and calls into question the reliability of these books and the origin of them. He says, indeed, the adherents of scriptural authority show distressingly little curiosity about the normally highly dubious historical origins of their holy books. So, first of all, he's committing this fallacy of changing the subject. But secondly, it's important to realize here too that he's going back and forth between religion and religious ideas and the existence of God. And the idea that we can get morality from the existence of God versus getting it from a religious source. Right? Those are not necessarily the same thing. And here's where he basically admits that there is no source of absolute moral standards if there is no God. He says, not all absolutism is derived from religion. Nevertheless, it is pretty hard to defend absolutist morals on grounds other than religious ones. The only competitor I can think of is patriotism, especially in times of war. And essentially, if there is no God, then there are no moral binding standards on us. We may be able to come up with a standard, as some ancient Greek philosophers did. Even though they were atheists, they still had a standard, human nature, right, and the natural law ethics. But just because we have a standard doesn't make it binding on us. There's nothing that makes it intrinsically right or wrong. Right? If there is no God, and there is no intrinsic right or wrong, then you can pick the most horrible acts you can think of. They are not intrinsically wrong. Another famous atheist agrees with Dawkins here. Ultimately, if there is no God, if there is no intrinsic meaning in the universe, and if there is no God, it's hard to imagine how there can be intrinsic meaning in the universe, then everything we do is ultimately meaningless. We can make up meaning for ourselves, But as philosophers, that's living dishonestly, right? That's living in an illusion of meaning that we create for ourselves. But that's not honest. That's not being in touch with reality, right? If there's no God, then there's no intrinsic meaning, no intrinsically right or wrong actions. And yet everything in our experience seems to contradict that. So here's the statement of Bertrand Russell. It's pretty long, so I'll just put the quote up, and if you want to read it, you can. But ultimately, he's saying that he's identifying what science gives to us, the worldview that science gives. Again, he's mixing up science and scientism. Science doesn't say anything about whether or not there's meaning or whether or not there is a God. But then people use that to try to argue for or against God. But that's not science per se. What I find surprising is that even though there is ultimately no standard set of morality, no binding moral standard on us, he then goes on to ridicule the morality of some Christians, of some religious people. It's hard to know where he gets his standard from. It looks as if he simply takes modern liberal morality and makes that the standard, and then judges everything else very harshly by that. But he's never given any argument that his set of morals are the correct ones. Essentially, he's using rhetoric to argue against religious people because of what some religious people have done and said. This is the fallacy of ad hominem. You point at the person rather than making a good, solid, logical argument. And it's all rhetoric, and once again, he has missed the high-level theology of Catholicism and high-level Christianity. Because he's not familiar with theology, it's excruciating to read his interpretations of the Bible, and that's really all they are. Here's a quote from the beginning of a review of Dawkins' book when it first came out. The simple fact is that there are standards for interpreting Scripture that come from the same church that gave us the Scripture. And here are some quotes relating to what it takes to understand the Bible when you read it. At this point, again, I'm going to give you some quotes. If you have the time to read them, you can do so, but they're pretty long, so I'm not going to take the time to read them out loud to you. At one point, he gets down on people for talking constantly about sin, like Augustine. He identifies Augustine as a person who seems to be obsessed with sin. I've read quite a bit of Augustine myself, and I don't see it. Mostly I read about the beauty of God and the beauty of what Christ has done for us. So it might be that he's oversensitive to it, that he encounters it here and there, and it is not something that we seem to focus on in society, so it catches his attention and catches him off guard. If some spiritual people do talk about sin, it's for the same reason that some scientists keep talking about pollution. They understand the damage that it does. And also for the same reason that doctors might talk about disease. They understand the damage. It's because these high-level theologians and these very spiritually aware people understand the damage that sin does to us. There is one person, Thomas Merton, who said that one sin is more damaging than an atomic bomb. Because an atomic bomb can't damn your soul, but one sin can tear apart our soul, the very fabric of our being. I've heard Peter Kraft say that there are two kinds of people in the world: the sinners who think that they're saints and the saints who know that they're sinners. Chapter 8, he talks about what is wrong with religion, but again, if there is no binding moral standard, then there is no wrong. The word wrong just means that he doesn't like it. And once again, he seems to just assume modern liberal standards of morality, and then he pits them up against the worst that religious people have done. Chapter 9 seems to be more of the same, but there is something in here I want to point out. He takes Thomas Aquinas out of context. He says Whatever they believe hell is actually like, all these hellfire enthusiasts seem to share the gloating schadenfreude and complacency of those who know they are among the saved, well conveyed by that foremost among theologians, Thomas Aquinas, in Summa Theologica, that the saints may enjoy their beatitude and the grace of God more abundantly, they are permitted to see the punishment of the damned in hell. Nice man. So let's take a look at this quote in context that he takes from Thomas Aquinas and see if Thomas Aquinas is talking about gloating in the punishment of other people. Thomas Aquinas says, a thing may be a matter of rejoicing in two ways. First, directly, when one rejoices in a thing as such, and such the saints will not rejoice in the punishment of the wicked. In other words, he's saying that the saints don't rejoice in the punishment of the wicked as such. They're not rejoicing in the punishments inasmuch as they are punishments, and that the damned are suffering. They don't rejoice in the suffering for the sake of that suffering. Secondly, indirectly, by reason namely of something annexed to it. And in this way the saints will rejoice in the punishment of the wicked, by considering therein the order of divine justice and their own deliverance, which will fill them with joy. So the reason they rejoice is in the justice of God. Right? That's like if someone were to commit a horrible crime, and then the judge were to give a particularly just sentence, right? We would praise the judge. Not hopefully not because we're just angry and we're gloating in the punishment of the person, but we're rejoicing in the wisdom and the justice of the person who gave that sentence. St. Augustine says something similar in his commentary on the Psalms. In the punishments of evil men, they have taken pleasure not in the ills of them, but in God's good judgment. And wheresoever in the Holy Scriptures we read of their hatreds against men, they were the hatreds of vices, which every man must needs hate in himself, if he loveth himself. So again, in the punishments, it's not the punishment necessarily that they're taking joy in, but in the glory of God. And again, the hatreds is not of men per se, but in the vices that they find there, and in the vices that we find in ourselves. So again, there's another fallacy here that Dawkins is committing, and that is taking out of context. The last chapter simply says that there are gaps. God, the idea of God, does not fill in the gaps because ultimately the idea of God fails, but his idea of evolution does. But I've already dealt a lot with that in the other videos, so I invite you to look there. Ultimately, the book is completely missing out on the high-level theology that we find in Catholicism, high-level philosophy. He's missing out on logic, the distinctions that are made in logic. There are very few, if any, rational logical arguments in the whole book. It's really just a whole lot of rhetoric and ridicule. Unfortunately, that can be convincing for a lot of people. But for people who understand philosophy and logical, rational thought, the book shouldn't be very convincing at all. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these videos, learned something from them. Please subscribe and share with your friends.